Hi. Thank you everybody for coming. I've been really excited to get to talk with both of you. And I guess I'll just start by saying, I think you were, if not the first, one of the first studio visits that I did post-pandemic. And I feel like I love studio visits, and they always feel really sort of generous and intimate. I'm aware that studio time is unbelievably precious. And so to be invited into that space is always a real privilege in a lot of ways. And with you, your studio is in your home. So it was in the kind of times of COVID and also just such an intimate space in and of itself. And I remember being just so keenly aware of the trust that is necessary to invite someone there. And it was just kind of incredible to see the work that you made, but also in the context of your family life.
It was lovely having you over. We had cookies and
we did
tea and
yeah.
And I'm so grateful that you were up for doing this. I've always just thought you were brilliant, and everything you say about mothering and art, it's just a wonderful combination and insight that I find so meaningful.
I think what the kind of special thing about visiting you in your space is that I think a lot of us sort of feel pressure to kind of condense that part of our lives, or it's hard for me not to talk about my children in any and all contexts. And it is lovely to be in a situation where it's just absolutely unavoidable. And I think, and also just sort of, there's a community there, and there's a reassurance too to seeing that other people are also very much living this way. My partner's studio is in our home, and the girls are in and out, and I'm in and out, and it just, there's this sort of, I won't say seamlessness, but there's this integration that is in so many ways a gift, and in so many ways really stressful. And I think it was definitely an immediate bond between us, that there was so much there that I recognized, both the good things and the tricky things. And I think it just, there's so much in your work that speaks to me, but also just to be able to see it in that context that was so familiar to me was really special.
Well, since you're looking at me, I'm sure you guys are all like, what is that guy doing? And I'll answer that question in two ways. One is that I am the primary caretaker of my two kids. My wife's job has zero flexibility. She's basically never home. So I'm the one who does all the work from, the house cleaning and taking care of the kids and getting them to point A, point B, and point C. So I do all that, what was traditionally, or is probably still viewed as the mom's job, right, is what I do. But the other thing is I've also written quite a bit on the nexus of art and parenting, which is what we're seeing up on this wall, and so I have a lot of skin in the game, intellectually and personally, in this subject that is here in these paintings. But I think what I want to do is just throw a little bit of a monkey wrench into this conversation, or problematize it a little bit. And this is not a surprise to them, they know. So, I'm not screwing it up. But I have on my lap, bell hooks, and also Maggie Nelson, who's another intellectual hero for me. And I just want to read you a quick quote from bell hooks that is kind of like a torch that's taken up by Maggie Nelson now. But she says, "Men will not share equally in parenting until they are taught, ideally from childhood on, that fatherhood has the same meaning and significance as motherhood. As long as women or society as a whole see the mother-child relationship as unique and special because the female carries the child in her body and gives birth, or makes this biological experience synonymous with women having a closer, more significant bond to children than the male parent, responsibility for childcare and child rearing will continue to be primarily women's work." And so I read that because I think we're at a paradoxical moment in our culture. On the one hand, work like this is so overdue in the art world, right? It's only been, I would say, despite the many victories that feminism has won since the mid-20th century, it's really only in the last 10 years that we're seeing motherhood in art in a meaningful, realistic way, as opposed to some kind of like nonsensical, romanticized crap that some guy made who's never cared for his kid in his life. And it's like, oh, look at my wife breastfeeding my child. It's all sugary and syrupy. And nonsense. This is actually like mothers making painting about motherhood, and that's a new thing, in terms of art history that happened like a nanosecond ago. So this is terribly important that we have this. At the same time, we're in this moment where toxic masculinity is out of control in this country all of a sudden, or maybe not all of a sudden, but nakedly so. Maybe that's the only new part, is it's so obvious. And in addition to that, we're in this tricky place where if we only see art about motherhood, and that's the only way we're talking about it, and where's like the art by fathers about taking care of their kids, and are there any fathers taking care of their kids besides me? I mean, there are, but are they making art about it? Not so much, and it's still rare, it's still quite rare. So we're in this tricky place where we're at the risk of reifying and digging yourself deeper into this pit, where it's like, moms raise children, and moms make art about raising children, and fatherhood is like still not a thing, you know what I mean? And so it just like digs us deeper into the problem. So it's a really funky paradox that we're in. But I want to just end by emphasizing again that this work is so important, because this content is very specific and hasn't yet, is barely emerging in culture, and it's necessary. So it's a problem, and I raise it because I don't have an answer for it, but it's just where we're at today.
I think, ironically, maybe I see it actually as less problematic. That I worked with the great Linda Nochlin, who absolutely drew a parity between intellectual labor and family labor. And with her, I worked on Mary Cassatt, who also really emphasized the inherent labor of motherhood. And I think explicitly and implicitly drew parallels between the office work that her brother and brothers-in-law did and the exact same kind of work that her sisters and sisters-in-law did in the home. And so when I come to Paige's work, and I think I absolutely agree with you that there is the trap, and I think that people have tried to sentimentalize Cassatt and a lot of other people in context, and the work, I hate to call myself a curator, the work that we do as curators is so important in that context of really providing that context. But I think I see the labor in the work. I think what Paige does especially well is not to sentimentalize the experience of parenthood in any form, and to make, you have all of these moments of sort of distance and quietness and like Cassatt did, like this transference of specifically female knowledge between the generations through literacy. I think it's all very much within that tradition for me.
What do you think?
I've been painting forever, since I was in high school, and painting the girls was, tricky. I've done it since they were little, but I've always felt a little self-conscious about it, and because of all the things that you spoke of, the sentimentality, and also I think Cassatt people dismiss Impressionism because it's so beautiful.
Totally.
It's so concerned with beauty, and that's a really big priority for me in painting and art. I love looking at beautiful paintings, and so I want to make a beautiful painting when I'm doing it, and because it's meaningful to me. And at the same time, I've just been drawing from what I see around me, the experience of light, color, atmosphere, and they're part of that world. I have this like interior world at home, and then the urban landscape and that wandering feeling. And I don't know, it's hard to say. I want it to be something that people can access, as these are people, they may be children, or this is a space, have you seen, a loved one reading a book, or watching television, or putting on makeup, those kind of everyday experiences that we have.
Yeah.
I think what's noteworthy, though, in your work, in sort of the context of what we've just been talking about, is it doesn't actually show parental labor. And I'm using the word parental, not maternal, on purpose, but because many people would say maternal labor instead, and I'm going to try to say parental. But these paintings, actually, there's only one painting in this whole show, the one in that side room over there, if anyone got a chance to see it, that's a view of some other mom in her kitchen. It looks like, she's doing some work, cleaning up dishes or making dinner, whatever. That's the only image of parental labor in this whole show. The way I see this show is the parental gaze, or maybe we can even say the maternal gaze is maybe even more accurate and specific to this show. And I think it's really powerful, the way your kids are also at an age where they are entering their own world, and that distance between you and them, that they're inhabiting their own space now, I think is really articulated in these paintings in a beautiful way, as well as your kind of the tenderness and love of your gaze and the way that these paintings present your kids. And so to me, that is very specific, but this show is not about parental labor. If anything, the labor that I see is the artist's labor, like the work of the painting itself, and the observing and the thinking and the composing and all of that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of it, which is, you talked about the labor of being an artist and how people view that and the way they view the labor of women and mothers and parents, and they're both not really seen as labor. Exactly.
Yeah.
You were saying that.
No, I agree. Yeah.
We're expressing ourselves, we're not working.
Yes.
Well, but Daniel, I thought it was interesting too that you mentioned that your wife's job has zero flexibility, and I think that was an adjustment for us, certainly in my family, that painting is Craig's full-time job, and so I think early on in our relationship, and especially early on in parenting, there was the perception of flexibility when it came to studio time. That there was a lot of me, and especially our extended family saying, well, why can't he? And Craig is like, no, this is my job. This is like, and I think both in terms of parenthood, and it's, I think one of the parodies that we can draw between raising children and a studio practice actually is that, like, there is this perception of flexibility. There's the perception of, like, well, you can do that another time, or your kids will deal with it. Just when they're actually, or should be, both quite rigid and disciplined in a lot of ways. There's, it is important.
Well, it's hard to keep a routine with children because something always comes
Totally.
up. Endless things come up.
Well, and we talked about that, the three of us, a little bit in our pre-conversation, is that, like, just sort of in a capitalist society, I think that there's so much of parenting that feels non-productive. There's so many days that are just tedious and boring. There's so many times where you're, with your kids and thinking of all of the things you could or should be doing. I think that there's this built-in sort of quote unquote lack of productivity to, again, both parenting and kind of a studio practice, that you have to kind of find a path forward there with what is productive in those moments, and also just maybe letting go of a need to be productive.
Yeah, and letting go of perfection. A lot of times I just have to let the housework slide because most of that,
Totally.
I do most, a lot of it. My husband is great, he helps out and stuff, but I do almost all the cooking and food shopping and stuff, and I, have to cut corners. I'm really bad about just leaving the laundry. I wash it and dry it, and then I just leave it. I'm like, I don't fold. And so if anybody wants clothes folded, because I just can't. There's not enough time to do everything.
There's not enough time. Well, and I think, and I've talked to a lot of other moms, that, COVID in that way was such a godsend, that I think that it was the first time that the four of us had really been together in an enclosed space. And I think, because of the way that we socialize women, there was so much of exactly what you were talking about with the bell hooks quote, Daniel, that so much that just sort of fell into my pile onto my lap with just doing things for the girls. And I think Craig was just there all day, every day, and noticing and realizing for the first time, like, when it was lunchtime, and like when we were running out of food, and when we needed to order toilet paper, and understanding intimately what their routines were. And I think it was like maybe the best thing that ever happened to our family in terms of equalizing labor a bit more than it had up to that point, because I think it became laid bare in ways that I had kind of just been picking up the slack forever.
Yeah, I think COVID was very Now you're sorry you came.
You didn't know I was going to throw him under the bus.
No, COVID was very significant that way because, part of sort of the path that feminism took in the 20th century was you had a lot of, and this is now Bell Hooks talking through me, I'm just paraphrasing her, you had a lot of white women, right, who were like, well, we want to work, we want to be in the workforce, we want to, and so having kids or being seen as a mother was sort of like a betrayal and was like, not feminist consciousness all of a sudden for, these white feminist thinkers who were trying to abandon or get away from, escape child raising in order to get into the workforce. And that was true in art too. Here in LA, we have Women's House, which was a women's collective of artists, and was just a studio complex. Children were not allowed in there. Dogs were allowed, but not children. So, it was there was this need to distance yourself, and Bell Hooks was like, well, hey, actually, for us women of color, our only chance to do labor that we love and are passionate about is when we take care of our own kids, because the rest of the time we're taking care of your kids. We're working all the time, and so we don't need to get away from our parenthood to get into the work world because we're stuck in the work world and we want to be with our kids. So there was a big disjunction right there in the feminist movement. But with COVID, the barrier between work and family was just destroyed.
Yeah.
Like all of a sudden you're doing your work in the middle of your family and your kids are like on your lap while you're typing, doing your thing. And so that all collapsed.
Totally.
And I think that was a huge transformation. And, I don't know if any of these paintings were made at the edge of COVID or was already done, but, that unity between you sitting there, among your family members and also painting it's really present,
Yes, well, I have the worst, well, it's not the worst, I'm grateful for it, but it's a very tricky setup. Like we have this big kind of living room and a section of it is my studio. And so you have the couch over there and the TV and the German Shepherd, and it's just, it's a little bit messy.
Yeah.
But I look at like Bonnard and Matisse and other painters, and you see that they were working in their homes. So it's not like a weird foreign thing. I think this like disembodied, beautifully lit building, where you get to work is kind of a newer concept, I think. I'm not sure. I mean, you have
yes and no.
Matisse, they have their big studios, but in some of the earlier work, it seems like they were working in their homes.
Oh, in those cases specifically, yeah. I mean, I think that there are historical studio buildings, but no, for the people that you mentioned, I think, it was a very integrated art and family life.
And Alice Neal.
Absolutely.
Who's should be held up by nobody as an example of motherhood, but
but she made it work. She got it done, and we can just revisit Winnicott's idea of the good enough mother,
totally,
right? Or Tala Madani's shit moms. I don't know how many people made it to that show, but it was such a great show because it was all about. There's this whole thing in our culture of mothers having to be like so perfect and so nurturing, and she was like, actually, here's a mom made of shit, and it's like just kind of getting through the day and failing all over the place, and that's also, and so it doesn't. I think we get stuck on a number of things. We get stuck on the idea that work and parenting or work and family are separate and public and private spaces, and they don't mix, and so. And so has set up like yours, I think really productively breaks that down, right? And rejects that and shows an alternative. And that's what we see on the walls is an alternative to that kind of capitalist, bifurcation, right?
Yeah.
But then also like Winnicott and Tala Madani and all this are also trying to like stomp out this idea of the perfect mom that, we should aspire to. And it's like impossible.
I also think, I think it's such a gift for our kids too, I work at home, Craig works in our house, I think they see our labor firsthand every day. I was raised by a single mom, and a sick day meant going into the office with her because there was nobody else to take care of me at home. That I saw firsthand almost every day how hard my mom was working. And I think, for a lot of women, there's a pressure to be perfect at work and perfect at home and to keep those worlds entirely separate. And I think one of the real gifts of a parent that works out of the home is that our kids get to see firsthand what that labor looks like, and especially in a world that's glamorized to the extent that the art world is, you know, that there's so many kids who want to be an art star. And I think my kids are going to know firsthand, like, how hard it is to make a painting, you know, and I think it's, you know, that they get to come to things like this and that they get to spend time in the studio and that they see me and I take time out of our day to take a call or whatever. Like, you know, I think that there's a part of that breakdown, of that integration that actually is as much a gift for them as it is for us. You know, I mean, it's, your girls watched this the whole way through and they saw what the end result of that was, which they have to be so proud of you.
Yeah, I don't know. I think they're just so used to it that they're not
There's
overly.
Yeah. I keep
They're just kind of.
I keep telling my girls when they go to Bennington, they're going to realize how cool their parents are. You know, like until then.
They do not think I'm cool. But and they don't want to be artists either.
I love that for them. I love that. Yeah.
I think they know it's hard.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, they appreciate art. Like it's great that they can appreciate it. Like I can go look at, you know, I can take my older one to galleries and museums, and she gets something out of them, and we can talk about it, which is so rewarding.
Totally.
I do think, though, again, like one of the strengths of your paintings in this show in particular is that it really does show the separation, you know, that they are inhabiting their world, you know, and you are looking in on it, you know, and you're looking in on it with an understanding, but it's still, you know, clearly their world, like, you know, the painting of your daughter's reading, you know, or, you know, dealing with makeup, or, you know, just hanging out, the two of them, you know, or together. I really think that that's something that is special about this work. And, you know, you think about some precursors, you know, it's often the child seen with the parent, you know, whether it's Alice Neal with the baby on the knee, or whether it's, you know, Kasai, you know, the kids are with the parents and under the supervision and management of the parents. And that's not what we see on this wall. And I think that is, you know, kind of important, and the kind of thing that it takes an engaged and involved parent to make these paintings, which is maybe why we haven't seen them before, because, you know, art historically, you have guys making paintings who aren't engaged with their kids, you know, and so this is something that's different and specific, and that's something I think is worth noting about the work. I don't know if that's something you thought about in making them, maybe you weren't, but it's there.
I hadn't really thought about it. I mean, I have to work around when they're home now. I can work with people around, but I usually have to like wipe off what they're doing, because I used to just have to when they were little, or, you know, sometimes you just have to finish something, or you can't stop working on it, so you're multitasking. But I really feel like at this point it's helpful when they're not home. You know, I paint when they're in school or they're out doing something, and I think that gives a little distance in a way than when they're, you know, watching TV behind me on the couch and I'm painting. So I don't know. That's really interesting, though. Sorry, I'm not as eloquent as you guys. You do.
Yeah, but you paint well.
You don't have to do both.
We're here for your painting.
Yeah. No, someone once asked me why I didn't go to art school, and I was like, oh, no, I can do the talking. That's the part that I'm good at, and I'm gonna stick to that part. But no, I think, and as a mother, I think the sense of distance that you've built into the paintings of your girls is like a thing that like speaks to my soul. You know, I think both as there is an essential loneliness to motherhood, you know, and I don't know if it's the same for fatherhood. I can't, but I think, you know, we're talking more and more about this sort of how lonely it can feel to be surrounded by people constantly. But also there's this sort of trust and almost something that comes shockingly close to like objectivity in your paintings of your girls, which I think is sort of scientific and intimate. And, you know, I'm going to be very uneloquent about it now, I guess, that just, it's the distance that I think is actually the really beautiful thing in the paintings of the girls. There's trust there, and also this, I can see you reclaiming a bit of that space for yourself, which is a thing that I relate to quite a lot.
Yeah, it's weird with children. You're around them all the time, but nobody ever really is very interested in you. You're just like a doer of things, you know, and it's constant grunt work, you know, constant chores, you know, and sometimes I can feel resentful. Sometimes I try to be grateful and be really present in the experience of doing those chores and use it to figure stuff out that I'm thinking about. But kids, the love is tremendous. I mean, I think we all exist in relationship to one another, whether we're parents or, you know, just as people. Like, we all have that sort of, that deep love and caring for others is just a human experience. There's something about, you know, parental love, but I think everybody experiences that in some form or another, just by, you know, what we have to do in life. How do you find the chores?
Well, you know, what I was just thinking to myself, I mean, of course I hate them, but what I was just thinking about, you know, as I was listening to you talk about it, is, you know, the nature of these chores and the nature of this work is it's labor of care, right? It's caring. This is work that is involved in the caring for a family, and the making of a painting is also an act of care. And, you know, you may, in order to carve out the space to care about the paintings and care for the paintings and make them, you have to say no once in a while to the caring for the family and all the work that entails. And I'm completely just, you know, I'm ripping off Maggie Nelson here. This is all just chapter 1 of her book On Freedom, which I highly recommend. But, you know, she sort of puzzles over this issue of, you know, there's a lot of art today that is, you know, positioned as, you know, healing a particular wound or solving a particular problem or advocating. It's like, it's called, you know, reparative. It's called the reparative turn in art, is like the way that critics write about it, is like we're making art to repair something that's wrong in our culture, which Maggie Nelson has no patience for, by the way. But she then talks about, you know, where caring is meaningful. And, you know, it's this interesting, I think what happens in these paintings implicitly is the union or kind of bridging of the care that we do as parents by, like, dealing with the laundry and making the dinner and feeding the kids and getting them to bed and all that kind of stuff. And and also caring for our art, you know, which is like, she quotes this wonderful quote from Amy Sillman, who Amy Sillman talks about, like, being up late at night with your apron on and your tongue between your teeth, holding your paintbrush, trying to get it just right, you know, and how earnest and caring that is and absurd, you know. But it's all about this kind of impulse of love, you know, that drives, it's all driven by the same thing, and it's a similar activity.
That's really interesting, seeing the connection between both.
Yeah. I think there's also, too, as someone who doesn't have a studio practice and came to other people's studio practices later in life, you know, there is the perception that especially a painting practice is all like drama and gesture and big, you know, like these glorious moments of revelation, and really so much of it is tedium, you know, that I think, you know, stretching paintings is hard and boring, gessoing paintings is hard and boring. So much of it is just covering the surface. You know, I think in my experience of a studio practice, the moments of really exciting revelation are few and far between. You know, I think there's actually quite a connection to parenting and caretaking there, that, you know, there are these moments where you think, yes, I'm doing everything right. And then, you know, you do 37 loads of laundry and unload the dishwasher again, and you have to do the bedtime routine. You know, it just is, I think probably actually those two things in a lot of ways feel actually quite similar.
Well, you know, and the interesting thing also is that if we look at the dominant cultural imaginary of the artist, right? It's like the Basquiat and the Van Gogh and the people who are like insane, you know, and like completely, they're the last person you would ever hope to put a kid to bed on time or take out the garbage or clean. They're not going to do that, right? And that's what the artist is supposed to be, this shamanistic, you know, way out there, you know, visionary. And this is quite the opposite, you know, entirely the opposite. And I think it's actually very important to break down and dispense with that, you know, kind of dominant cultural idea of the artist, and break it down and be done with it. And this is, you know, this is real life up here, you know. So I think it's so important.
That's, yeah, I mean, people do question me about it. They say, how do you have the time? And they'll refer to painting time as me time. I think I mentioned that to you. And so there is a weird thing. You already kind of like you kind of feel like a clown being an artist, and then you also feel like a clown being a mother, because everyone's, when you're a mother, people are just always watching you. You know, when you're pregnant, it starts there. They start talking about your body and how big you're getting, and yes, and it doesn't stop, and some days, are just horrible, and some days are really great, and some days I make, big mistakes, and, or just lose my patience, and my husband always reminds me, he's like, you only have to get it right 70% of the time. I'm not sure where he read it, because he said, you're doing more than 70%, so you're good.
Yeah. That's a high mark right there.
Yeah.
Well, I think when we were preparing for this too, I asked you if there was a difference in your practice post-parenting, or pre-parenthood and post-parenthood, and your answer was actually very humbling, I think, for me, that you were just kind of like, no, I've always worked. Like, I had a day job and I made the paintings on nights and weekends, and then I had kids and I made the paintings on nights and weekends. And I think, also imploding that myth of the artist, that parenting is just another kind of work, but also the myth of somebody who just gets unlimited studio time no matter what and gets to just be in there and kind of is also sort of, not something that's a reality for most people. And so it's less of a before and after and more of a just kind of dynamic shift.
Yeah, and I think it's, with caregivers and women in particular, you think about male artists in the past and how, people really supported their daily lives with the chores.
When
and
I was doing
the food and
doctoral
all that.
coursework, someone asked an old professor what the most important process of a dissertation was, and he said having a wife. And I feel like it's kind of the same with studio practices.
And it's weird when you're the wife and the, trying to do this little thing that's, perceived as ridiculous and selfish. But you just have to do it because it's just what you've always done. Yeah. And it's who you are. And my husband's really supportive because he's known me since we were really young, and he's always just supports it, and so I feel very blessed. I mean, he's a great partner.
I guess that's the thing I would ask the two of you is how do you make space for your creative brain? I think my job is overwhelmingly logistical, and there's days that I'm so tired or so caught up in making sure we've registered for camps or laundry lists or whatever that just it's all I can do to get through mindless data entry kind of things. And I'm in awe of people who do that and make space to shut all of that out and be creative. I think that's, I don't honestly know that I could do that. And is it work? Is it something that you learn to do, or do you just do it because you have to?
I think it comes out of all that.
Yeah.
There's so much toiling in the day. I feel like those dull moments, the in-between moments are what interests me a lot of the time. And it's not like I want to record standing in line at the DMV necessarily, but maybe something about the light that I notice when I'm standing in line at the DMV, or a particular person. I really noticed that a lot when I would just walk, particularly before I had the dog. Just watching people, and those, I don't know, I kind of diverged from there. What do you think?
No, well, before I talk about my own experience, I do want to say, because I do want to keep bringing it back to your work on the wall here, which is why we're all assembled, is, I feel like your paintings do a really nice job of enlivening or identifying those in-between moments. Like your daughter with the mascara and just the way she's bathed in this light. It's like you take something that is so mundane and would easily or probably most often be completely overlooked as irrelevant and meaningless, by the way, by all the artists who have lived up until 5 seconds ago, and you make it meaningful and you show it as worthy of attention, and then, that painting of your daughter, just standing there doing nothing really, but you just capture a moment that kind of takes this moment of like tweenhood, or maybe she's an early adolescent, I don't know, but somewhere right on the cusp. It's right on the cusp of this transformation that she's gonna go through, and you like put it in amber, and it's there now. And so I think these are really powerful things that you notice because of the way you work and the way these things all are juggled, and this is actually reminds me of a thing that Helen Molesworth wrote about Ruth Asawa. Ruth Asawa, like Alice Neal and so many others, was dismissed as like a housewife, and that her work was craft and blah, and we don't care, and she was raising, I think, 6 kids all around her, while she was making her sculpture. And she was dismissed as a housewife, and Helen Molesworth comes back and says, what can we learn from the housewife artist? What did they have to teach us that we're missing? And so your work is speaking to that very directly, and I think and very successfully. And as for me, in terms of my own daily life, I've been talking about the Maggie Nelson book. Well, the first way I went through that book was as an audiobook while I'm folding laundry and preparing dinner and cleaning the house and, all that kind of, everything but vacuuming, because the vacuum's too loud, right? If I'm not vacuuming, I'm like, got an audiobook going. And then, because we had this talk and because it's a deeper subject I write about, I then of course got the book and read it also. But audiobooks are huge for me as a way of kind of making that all work out, and then for, a lot of the writing, thank God we have schools that we can send our kids to, Used to be back in the day, they would be in the factory, right? Now they're in school. But that can occasionally, the problem is, of course, there's always something broken in the house that I need to fix or whatever. Like I'm trying to fix a toilet right now. But, it's like, when I can steal some time during the day, which is rare, I do. But other than that, it's like the whole family goes to sleep, and that's when I can get work. Often is the case.
It's your studio in your...
I used to have a separate studio that ended in COVID, and then now it's, what was our garage is studio space now. I just converted it,
Which is actually... Craig's studio was downtown for a while when we lived in Hollywood, and we had to like keep an intense eye on the Dodgers schedule, because if there was a day game, it was just like not even worth it, And it's actually, I think that's where the home studio is such a gift, that he can pop up for bedtime, he can go down after bedtime, it just is, it allows so much more access both to the work and to the family. I think it'll be hard to actually, I think, go back to a separate space, but he says no.
Come on up here, Craig. But actually, I do want to, this is a conversation that we can also, if anyone wants to jump in with questions, comments, thoughts, I want to make sure we open it up, please.
I'm big fan, as you know, Paige. I just wanted to mention something that you were kind of dancing around but didn't actually say, is that there's not many paintings of parenting that show children past the age of 5. And motherhood, I'm a mother, and I paint about this actually, but is for life. My mother at 85 is still my mother. I still had a relationship with her, and she was still mothering me in her way, which I kept trying to reject. It's forever, and I don't understand. I think it's important to show that it's a lifelong relationship, like any other intimate relationship.
Alice Neal painted
I was going to say,
her
That's
sons
really
when they were adults.
Right.
But it's rare. It's very rare.
I don't know that those felt parenting, really. They felt, to me, they felt kind of, all of hers, you felt the personality of the sitter. But I don't think you felt necessarily a maternal situation there.
And even so, it's still the exception that proves the rule. Your basic point is fundamentally correct, which is that you don't see those paintings. You don't see that.
And we all live it. We all live with our parents or our children our whole lives. And so I like the labor part, it does change, as we all know. Like you're not changing diapers anymore, but you have to drive them to a million dance lessons or whatever the heck.
I think also, and I'm thinking of Laurie Simmons in this case, like I think the other thing that happens when adults or when artists depict teen and adult children is that it recognizes them, acknowledges them as whole people. I think there's something about babies and toddlers where they're just sort of adorable props in a lot of ways, especially in Cassatt.
And Madonna and Child
Totally.
Oh,
And I
wow.
think, you know, that the artists who continue to depict their children almost always do so in a way that recognizes an essential personhood in a way that's really sort of respectful and exciting, I think. And that's, you know, I think, you know, I haven't met your girls, but I have a sense of who they are, I think, from the way that you depict them.
And the whole domestic vibe, there's a real mood to all of
Totally.
it that's really lovely.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to say that, so Paige and I, we lived in the same neighborhood and our kids went to preschool together. And,
We met at preschool.
yeah, we met at preschool. But it's interesting because when we're together, I don't think we ever speak about our children. We only speak as painters. And I think that it's interesting to have seen your work evolve. Because yes, these works depict your daughters, but they still maintain the same tone in which you've always depicted figures, and it's been interesting to see how you've brought in these, you know, real people that you interact with, but you're still addressing them in this way that's very true to you as a painter primarily, like not as a mother. Yes, they are present as your children, but it's, you know, primarily about the painting itself, which is what's so exciting to me. And yeah, they're just such a beautiful way of exploring this, because I have teenagers as well. And it's, you know, they're coming into their own lives and their own sexuality and everything, and then you're kind of seeing yourself like through their journey as well, which is really exciting to be in. Yeah, and it's nicely presented in this.
Right, and the change in your relationship and the dynamic and how you're, you know, when your child is little, you love and support them, and you're still doing that. There's a lot of physical labor still as they get older, but you also have a much more complicated emotional, and just with your relationship gets more complicated.
And I'm going to say, you know, this may have been the last thing on your mind, but that's exactly how I read your flower paintings. Because the flower is a sexual organ, right? And we talk about kids flowering into adulthood.
Particularly girls.
Yeah, big time, big time. Maybe you would talk, yeah, probably with boys you wouldn't even use that word. But with girls, that's a very common language. They're blooming into, you know, blah. And so I see your flower paintings in that context, you know, and especially within this show, which is all about teenage or preteen girls. Like suddenly the flowers are like very specific to me in terms of how I respond to them.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it. You know, I know that flowers are often, you know, symbols for that. And, you know, everyone was always telling Georgia O'Keeffe that her flowers were sexual, and she's like,
I mean, they 100% are. I'm not buying any arguments to the contrary. I've seen those flowers, and no one is going to talk me out of it.
I have a question.
Yes.
Paige, what's your interaction with your daughters about the paintings? Do you talk with them about it? Like, is there any type of, like, how do they feel about the paintings? I'm just curious about the stuff.
like the ones that they're in, they like them surprisingly, but they're not overly interested. They're just not super interested in me or my work, you know? Like they're gonna be here eventually today. But they had to do their stuff that they needed to get done, basketball and karate. It was not, they weren't gonna come, you know, change their schedule for this.
Yeah. My son refused to come here also. It's like, you want to come to the pen? It's like, no.
Yeah, so far they're so good. The oldest one is going through a very big self-conscious phase where she just feels ugly and very, it's very difficult, but I can't even hardly take a photo of her anymore without her like yanking my phone and wanting to look at it. But so far she, you know, I ask her, you know, how do you feel about these paintings? And they're just like, they barely look at them. They're like, fine, I like them.
Right, don't bother us, Mom.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a question. How do you feel like your observations of Los Angeles, like how that works with your observation of a domestic space? Like one's very external and one's very internal.
I was thinking about that. I think color and light are the connection, and sort of seeing things as an environment. And you know, I feel like you can really make a painting about anything, like the smallest thing. And so it's kind of the language of painting, I think, that ties it together. But there's also that they're both they both have that kind of quiet or observant, you know, like state. I think I spend a lot of time not talking to people, and or like alone in a weird way, even when people are around. So I think that's kind of what ties it together, but definitely the color.
Yeah, because in both cases, you're kind of outside, like observing, and like with the chateau, it's like you're not a guest there, you're like down the street. And then same with like the mascara, like she has her internal world that is totally separate from you.
I like
Yeah.
that. That's nice.
really
Yeah.
interesting.
The other thing that I see in relation to the point you're raising is, again, to me, it's like I see a lot of evidence everywhere of this paternal gaze. I'm not paternal, parental gaze, sorry. This parental gaze. Like even in this one behind you, you know, it's like a pollution painting, right? Like we get those colors in LA because of the polluted air that we have to breathe, but then we get really great sunsets. So like, to me, you know, also as a parent who worries about my kid's future on this planet, you know, as like we destroy it from day to day, I view that as like, you know, this interesting kind of mixed bag of like, it's so beautiful, but, you know, is this city going to exist in 20 years, you know?
Right.
So I like, in a lot of these paintings that may not actually portray your kids, I still see that parental gaze, and I hadn't been able to figure out the chateau, but you just gave a beautiful interpretation to link that up, you know, which again, none of this may be on your mind at all, but it can still exist in the work, you know.
Really interesting. Well, it's so much about what people perceive and how they experience it. You make something to share with other people, and then it becomes theirs in a way.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You know,
As soon as you hang it on the wall, it's out of your hands.
Right.
Literally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I do think that you create a context by having so many, the predominant quantity of the paintings is your daughters and you looking at them. And so then that creates the context in which we interpret the whole show.
Mm-hmm. I think people are going to be drawn to figures naturally too, because they, you know, we want to see our lives reflected back to us. We're looking for answers most of the time in our own heads, and so you're kind of, you know, when you're out in the world, you're looking for something that kind of reassures you or affirms what you're experiencing, or helps you escape in some way.
Yeah.
Some of those.
Yeah. Yeah, all those things are at play all the time, and not consciously even, you know, but they're all, you know, kind of nudging us this way and that way in the
Right.
studio.
Just have a quick question. I mean, I've got family questions for you. It's so interesting. Your work is so strong, powerful, and really beautiful. I do love Chateau, and this piece is very interesting because it's from a view that I'm trying to understand what you thought of when you were doing this painting. What was it that you were thinking of, or where were you standing? How did you come up with that?
I had gone to an event. I don't go to Hollywood all the time, so when I do go there and I see the chateau, it always kind of takes my breath away a little bit because it's so famous, and it's like, oh, there it is. You know, it's like, it's a landmark. And so I was at an event there in a house up there in the hills, and there was a really nice house, and I was walking back to my car. I had parked some weird place, and I was coming down the hill, and the sun was setting, and it was like that chateau was just like confronting me, you know, and I also had this feeling of not really belonging at the same time, you know, like this is, I live here in LA, but I'm not like a Hollywood, you know, person, etc. And I've never been to the chateau. Like, I know people go there and have drinks and stuff, but I don't know, it's a beautiful building. It's really interesting. And it also has kind of a Disneyland quality.
I can see that. I can see it's real awesome. It feels like the person who made this book doesn't really have access to it, but is understanding the part of the world that it takes.
Thank you.
I think it's the funny thing. I mean, we're from the Midwest. I think it's one of the funny things about raising kids, raising city babies anyway, but raising kids in LA too, that like we had a very small apartment in Hollywood, and the Hollywood sign was one of the ways that Ruby knew we were almost home. And her sitter at the time used to take her over to the observatory to like run around. Like I think I was watching the reel that you did of the church by your house that you used to take your girls to run, and there were so many of those spaces in our neighborhood that we didn't have space inside the house. And then during COVID, you know, they just needed to run, and we like had like 10 feet of sidewalk on our whole block. Like finding those spaces in your world that you have this incredibly intimate routine relationship with, but also really do kind of, they're as indoors as they are outdoors. You know, they are, there's like these things that are like these like shocking landmarks that are like just like one of the things your kids see every day, you know, that just, but also like the outdoor spaces that really just become part of your sort of family routine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
During COVID, I used to take my kids to like the empty parking lots, like the zoo parking lot or whatever, and they would skateboard, and you know, the police would come and throw us out, and we'd come back the next day, you know. But it was very much about that, of like commandeering these abandoned public spaces, you know, for the family, for the kids.
Yeah.
Definitely.
That you get to know like as well as you knew your living room. Yeah.
Well, it becomes, because you've got to get out of your living room.
Totally.
During COVID, where we had nowhere to go, and so you had to like figure it out. You know?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It was very punk for a few minutes. Other thoughts or questions anyone
Do
have?
you think it was COVID that sort of quieted a little bit what's the word, like the stigma of the artist mother? Like I know back in grad school, it was like you're either a mother or an artist, and you couldn't be both.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering when you guys feel like that sort of lifted, or it hasn't even, like, you know.
I do think COVID helped.
Yeah.
I do think it helped blow that apart, you know, to a degree, because suddenly everyone was working from home, you know, and that separation between work and home and public and private was like gone. You know, it was like, I don't know if you saw, there was a moment, I don't know if this will resonate for people. There's this video that went viral of this guy who was like on TV being like the, you know, expert on some subject, and he's talking whatever, and then the door flies open and his kids run in. Remember that one? But that was, to me, that just exemplified what happened with COVID. And I do think that myth. You know, I can remember when I went to grad school, there was a professor who didn't have kids, and she sat us down and like explained to us that you couldn't have a normal life. And I was like, art is about freedom and finding your own way. What are you telling me how to, you know, what my options are? Like, shut up, you know. But it's a real thing. It's a big, big thing, and I think it's still very heavy. I don't know if you talked about getting judged a lot, you know, but artist moms get judged a lot.
Yeah. Right. Well, you know, I think if you're really successful and sort of irrefutable, then people probably don't, you know, but if you're kind of, you know, working it out and you're doing it and it doesn't seem to have any value monetarily or culturally, then you're selfish or a fool.
Right.
Right. And, you know, people don't understand it, and they don't, you know, I think it comes down to success. It depends on how successful people are a lot of the time.
Yeah, my wife thinks I am deluded and a fool. That's absolutely true.
She does not.
but it's that issue. It's that issue like that you're describing. I think that, and actually, you know, just to go back to Maggie Nelson, who's incredibly successul, right, as an intellectual, but she, you know, her husband is an artist, and they both deal with that because neither of them, you know, their work, even though it's well known, is not lucrative, you know, in terms of commercial success,
right.
Even though they're both really highly regarded. And that tension is a real thing, you know, when your labors of love are not producing money, whether it's because you're caring for children and raising them, or whether you're making art that isn't like, you know, selling for, you know, $100,000 a pop, it's not valued. You know, that's just, we're in a capitalist society, and that's the structure we're in, and it's hard.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you talked a little bit about letting go of the perfect, and I think that that's where, you know, this one of the primary feminist myths of like having it all has been doing it all perfectly, and I think this perception that you show up to your job and you're just a person who works there and you do your job excellently, and then you go home and you run your house with like, you know, and like equal skill and never break a sweat. And, you know, I think that's where COVID was a huge gift, I think, in a lot of ways, is that it made that, keeping that veneer impossible.
Yeah.
And I got so many more emails, or, you know, kind of email messages during that period that, you know, the response time was longer. And it's a thing that I have personally tried to do, is really make that part of my life really transparent, you know, bringing my kids to galleries, bringing them to meetings when it's appropriate, you know, saying like, I'm home with my kids, it's the summertime, they're not in camp, like we're balancing both. And I think that's, as women especially, and as parents generally, it's one of the kindest, most feminist, most radical things that we can do for each other, is to acknowledge our home labors as part of our work life, and not try to keep up, you know, the image that we're just simply doing it all, you know. And like I think yeah, COVID was great for that, actually. I think a lot of us had been doing it for a while, and it felt like it was a lot more even suddenly.
Yeah.
I have a question that's completely parental in a way, but I get a lot of beef from people who are not artists about having this like hobby, and I feel like they have 3 jobs in a way. It's like you said, you know, you're always working daytime, and then you have your art practice, but then as a mother, it's like daytime art practice and plus being a parent. And I, going back to getting beef from my friends who have no kids, say like, why are you picking them up? Just leave, or ones with kids, like, just leave them, just let them fend for themselves and do this. And so I get it from both ends in a way of like, my kids are not as important and my art practice is not as important. And the only thing that maybe has the most importance is the income bringing in. So I was wondering how it sort of came up with you all and your peer group or friends or family.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of pressure, you know, for both to do it all, and also, you know, to have like the other job too, which I do the other job also, you know. But if you know, what's your day job? This is just kind of goofing off, and you know, I don't know. I think I'm embarrassed to be an artist a lot of the time, or I don't acknowledge it, you know, because it's a weird thing to tell people just in your daily life. You know, the good parent friends that I have, you know, I try not to talk about it too much, because I think it's probably kind of like I'd be more comfortable talking about the JOB job than the painting role, because it seems more legitimate, and maybe that's how I, you know, if I don't know. You know, my parents were not like big art people. They supported that I did it, but they didn't really like understand it. So I think I've always sort of felt a little bit like bashful about it. I don't know if that.
Well, I think the other thing that's very specific to parental labor, there you go.
There's my family.
The other thing that's very specific to parental labor, which I think is something you're touching on, and again, I'm just going to, you know, steal from Maggie Nelson here, is that it's a category of care to which we can't say no, you know. So like your school calls and your kid has a fever and your kid has to go home. You can't say no, you know, and that's a very specific thing. And, you know, and paintings also don't get done if you say no. Like you have to find a way to, like, these are things to which you have to respond. And it's different from other kinds of labor, and it makes it much more challenging and much more acute, and that dilemma, you know, that razor's edge much sharper and harder. And that's very specific to child raising.
Yes.
I think the flip of that is I'm like an Anne Helen Peterson devotee, and she talks a lot about hobbies and the capitalization of hobbies in this current moment. And, you know, what the ironic trend, I think, among all of my friends who don't have an art practice, you know, who are just parenting and have sort of a straight job, is that they're all trying to find that creative practice. You know, there's like 17 pottery studios in my neighborhood now, you know, everybody's doing like needlepoint or knitting or, you know, I think ironically, all the straight kids are now trying to figure out how to find that part of themselves. You know, that I've never had, I mean, I'm like a nitty person, but like I've always been really jealous of people who find and identify a creative practice that I think the irony of it is that those of us who don't have it are really trying to find it and are trying to fit it into you know, the straight job and the parenting. So tell them to leave you alone.
That's the hobby, right? For them, in a way.
Totally. But I think, you know, I think we're increasingly recognizing that it's maybe, yeah, I didn't mean to contextualize it as a hobby there. Maybe that's what I did inadvertently. But I think, you know, maybe part of it is jealousy, you know, maybe, or just that trying to find, there are those among us who have like found that balance between creative practice and some kind of income stream and a family life. And I think probably the rest of us are just trying to figure that out.
I'm also trying to figure out.
We're all trying to figure it out.
Yes.
I just wanted to say, it's interesting me hearing this, because I would say, like, I kind of keep being a parent on the down low, I would say, that people are like shocked that I'm a parent. And I actually had to give up, I think, lots of friendships with people that weren't artists, because I didn't like getting that.
You got to move to the east side.
And
Come on over.
I say, like,
We got a club.
that's like why you're wasting your
friends
time.
are on the east side,
Yeah.
you know, because I live near Paige.
Yeah.
And like my kids went to school in Cheviot Hills, and everyone didn't really maybe understand where
Yeah.
it's coming from, and so I was sort of like, all right, well, I'll just be friends with Paige and with Therese, and then it's
Right.
a lot easier, because it isn't something that people can totally get, and
Yeah.
that's fine. Like, they're just not, you know, people that I need to hang out with.
I think it's still a little taboo to be a parent and an artist.
Yeah.
Very much so. Very much so. Absolutely it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
All
Thank you so
right.
much, Paige.
Thank you. Thank you.